Good morning. It's Wednesday, March the 9th. Welcome to Open Mics. I'm Dr. Stephen Stites, Chief Medical Officer here at the University of Kansas Health System, broadcasting live with you from the Dell Simons Family Studio. COVID cases may be on the decline, but those in need of life-saving transplants are still impacted by strict requirements. This morning we talk about the impact the virus is having on transplants, plus the impact the vaccine is playing in all of this. And is it better to get the organ donations from a living or a deceased donor? A lot to break down this morning. But first, Jessica Lovell joins us from Studio B with a look at this morning's medical headlines and a little weather. Thanks a lot for that. Good morning, Jess.
Yeah, right. Hey, good morning, Dr. Stites, and everyone here joining us this morning. In our medical headlines today, not getting enough sleep could increase your risk of heart disease by as much as 140%. The study
That just means
conducted.
I'm done, guys. I'm cooked right there. I'm done. Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, I didn't like that study, just to say.
Okay, so yeah, I know, it affects us all. So this was conducted at the University of South Florida, found that those who get 4 or few hours of sleep had heart murmurs or an enlarged heart. So get your sleep. And speaking of your heart and the rest of your body, a new study out of Britain finds those who swim, cycle, even walk or row for 30 or up to 60 minutes each week lowered the risk of dying by as much as 20%. Researchers say those exercises help strengthen muscles. They say adding weightlifting and other resistance training also helps. When it comes to your back, that could be a bit of a sore. It could be a little bit sore tomorrow. A live look now at the Broadway Bridge in downtown Kansas City. Let's take a look out there. The metro will be under a winter storm warning starting at 9 o'clock tonight. So plan ahead. This will last through 6 a.m. on Friday. Anywhere from 5 to 7 inches of snow is possible, meaning roads could be pretty bad all through tomorrow. Again, so just slow down, plan ahead. Be careful out there. The Olathe School District is asking the Kansas City Metro to stand in solidarity after Friday's school shooting at Olathe East High School by wearing orange and blue today. Dr. Stites, I see you in navy over there. So a tweet that was put out by the school says today is Orange and Blue Day. This comes just 5 days after police say an 18-year-old shot a school resource officer and the school's vice principal. Both are now at home recovering. And Dr. Stites, I don't know if you remember, but last Thursday on the show, on the Morning Medical Update, psychologist Dr. Greg Nawalnik, he was discussing how to talk to your kids about things like school shootings and the war in Ukraine, issues that also sometimes feel like they're just a million miles away from kids in our area. So he was here one day talking about if it happened, and then the very next day later on the local nightly news, he was giving advice to parents now that it had happened. So just one day later. So Dr. Stites, I was just thinking on the drive-in this morning, you've always said COVID, it doesn't discriminate, doesn't care what color you are, where you live, who you pray to. And really the same goes for violence and mental health issues. They simply do not discriminate. And it's so important to use moments like this to talk about it and open up those lines of communication, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I know this is the same message we've had from Dr. Nawalnik and other of our mental health providers who have been on our program throughout the pandemic. And it is this. You've got to talk. The worst thing you can do is not communicate with your family, and I think it's absolutely true. We've said COVID doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care what political party you're in. It doesn't care what state you live in. It doesn't care what the state line is. And I would say the same thing's true about mental health and most other problems that are related to disease. Disease doesn't really discriminate. And I think what we have to learn from that is that when we fight things together, when we join together to take on these types of issues like mental health issues and COVID, et cetera, the more we work together, the more we can win. And I think ultimately that should be our goal, because the Olathe East shooting, I think, shook us to the core in our community. It always just makes so much more of an impact when it's so close to home and it's people you know. And hopefully that will help us come together around things like mental health issues and not be split apart.
Well said, Dr. Stites. Also, we want to just make mention that so many people, they write in, they want to know how they can show their appreciation for you, Dr. Hawkinson, and all the hard work of all of our doctors, like Dr. Schmidt and Dr. Klein as well. And you all deserve so much recognition. And so we're going to put up a QR code on the screen right now so that all of you can record a video, a short video, about 30 seconds. You can send it in just to say thank you to our workers. So we're going to keep this QR code up on throughout the show so that people can click on it. It'll take you straight to an email, your email, and then it'll go straight here to us so that we can then, of course, show them on our program.
Thank you. All right. Make sure to get your questions sent in to us on YouTube, Facebook, Facetube, good Lord, the Medical News Network, and now Twitter. You can find those links to that right here on your screen. And just to say, I did the math, Jess, while you were giving the news update. So I'm at a 40% increased risk because I don't sleep, but a 20% decrease because I work out. And now I have to sit with people like Schmidt and Klein here, and I'm not sure which direction that moves the arrow. I don't know if that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing. I guess we'll find out during the program here this morning. Okay, we're going to have your updated COVID count with Doc Hawk just up in a few minutes. First of all, let's just see if there's any reporter questions popping up. Not hearing any. So, hey, the number of transplants in the U.S. totaled more than 41,300 last year. That's a very big number. The first time that number's eclipsed 40,000. And we are talking transplant this morning. Joining me here in the studio is Dr. Timothy Schmidt, the director of transplantation and transplant surgeon Dr. Jeffrey Klein, who is one of our kidney transplant surgeons. Gentlemen, good morning to you both.
Morning. Thanks for having us.
Good. Are you exercising?
Try.
Sometimes. But they said if you have don't sleep, you get a bigger heart, so that means we care more.
Oh, is that what that angle
Yeah.
was? Okay, got it. I missed that part. So I must have this.
I have a big heart.
Yeah, you do have a big heart. I've got a big heart. Okay, good. All right. Well, Dr. Schmidt, let's talk a little bit about the impact COVID had on transplants. I mean, last year, everything was kind of crazy. I would have thought everything was going to be bad, but it was a record-breaking year. So that's good things. How are things here at the health system?
Last year we had a fairly good year for transplant. COVID obviously slowed things down with our elective transplants, the living donor transplants. We had to have multiple impacts over the COVID time. And then we had to deal with how does COVID affect donation and come full circle with COVID positive donors. But overall, I think it has increased our efficiency. It's allowed telehealth to become more important in our clinics. And then I think overall, I think we've become a better transplant center because of COVID.
Yeah, which is a remarkable statement. But I think that's true. I think a lot of hospitals have worked hard to be safer as a result of the COVID-19. It changed how we did infection control and masking around all patient care areas. I think that's actually, there's some really good outcomes from that for patients. Talk to us a little bit about vaccine and transplants, because we've heard stories from all over the country that folks have been rejected for organ transplants because they will not get the COVID vaccine. What are the requirements here, and why do people need to get a COVID vaccine prior to transplant?
Well, I think it's just part of the whole process. We want people to survive after transplant, and so we'll look at people for their heart disease or lung disease, and we wouldn't transplant somebody with a terrible heart because they might not survive the operation. The same with the vaccine. Jeff can probably share the numbers later, but we have had multiple patients get COVID after transplant, and the risk of dying with COVID after transplant is almost 10 to 13%. That's actually higher than the actual transplant itself. If you undergo a liver transplant, a heart transplant, kidney transplant, you shouldn't die. You have a 1% or less risk of actually dying during the case. But if you get COVID after transplant, your risk of dying is almost 10 to 15%. So that's why
That's a pretty big jump in increase, right, as a result of COVID-19. And so I was talking to some of the lung transplant centers that we refer a lot of folks out, manage a lot of people back here for lung transplant. And Omicron was especially difficult for lung transplant recipients. What about Omicron and liver or Omicron and kidney transplants? How has that been?
It was fairly devastating. I mean, we were seeing an email every other day about a patient getting COVID and dying who was someone we are following after transplant. So, I mean, the rate of infection was extremely high, and it was a scary time for people with immunosuppression or having a transplanted organ. I feel like that's my experience with the Omicron.
So I think, Dr. Klein, from your standpoint, one of the things that we know is that organs are a scarce resource. And it feels like we have to do the best possible job of managing those, which means you have to give them to someone who you think is going to survive, because otherwise you've kind of wasted an organ.
It's true. This is one of the challenges that we run into is transplants come out of organ donation largely from deceased donors, and it's a scarce resource. So we are careful with keeping people safe on the wait list and making sure that they have the best possible outcome after transplant. That's for us as a center to make sure that we take care of the people that we intend to transplant and make sure they have the best possible outcome.
So Tim, this whole thing about vaccination transplant, it stirred up a little controversy. We still require vaccination prior to transplant, is that right?
Yeah, we require vaccine prior to transplant just for the pre-stated reasons. We want people to survive after transplant, and the risk of the vaccine, if you look at the real data, is almost zero. The risk of COVID after transplant is real, and the risk of dying with COVID is even more real. So it's hard to even make a argument why we shouldn't have the vaccine before transplant, and we certainly require it just for safety, and we want the patients to survive.
I mean, I think that makes sense to me, because if a patient was having a heart attack, you wouldn't transplant them right then, right?
Correct. And what I'd add to that is that most people, when they get coronavirus, will not die of the disease. However, they may have issues that make it hard to take their pills, hard to hydrate, and their graft outcomes can suffer because of it. So the vaccination makes their time with disease easier and their course shorter.
So I would think what I know is in the lung transplant world, gosh, these folks, when they've gotten COVID, there's been a higher rate of death, much higher than it is in the general community. Oh, yeah. And so really have pushed for vaccination, and really the vaccine schedule in a transplant's a lot more aggressive. You get a shot, your first shot, a shot a month later, a shot a month later, and a shot 3 months later now. So, I mean, we've really approached it pretty aggressively. What other breakthroughs are out there to try and help manage COVID in transplant populations, Dr. Schmidt?
Well, I would leave that one to Jeff. The medical treatments for the COVID are really, I would ask Dr.
All right,
Klein
Dr. Klein. And I identified you as a nephrology surgeon. I said nephrologist.
Many hats this morning.
There you go. Sorry about that.
No, it's one of the challenges that we run into is keeping transplant patients safe, and the vaccination really is the best way forward. That generally includes booster or fourth doses at this point, sometimes more, depending on the level of immune compromise that they have. At the same time, the CDC guidelines have stayed in place for many of our patients. They still mask, they social distance, they're cautious with their time out in public.
So talk to us a little bit about this thing of deceased versus living transplants, because it seems scary to me to take someone who is healthy, you take one of their organs, kidney or part of a liver, I guess, and put it in someone who needs a transplant, and usually a family member or somebody you know. So talk to us a little bit about that whole process of living donor transplantation.
Sure. Out of the scarcity of deceased donors came the possibility for living donation, and living donation has enabled really healthy individuals, or individuals that from a kidney standpoint are unlikely to encounter kidney disease in their lifetime. They can donate a kidney since they're healthy and can go through the process of surgery. They are able to donate that kidney in close succession to an individual in need. As such, those kidneys work almost invariably right away. They last longer and work better than a deceased donor.
Why is that? Why do they work better, and why do they go longer? Is it because the person's related? Are they a better match? Or is it because that organ has never been preserved?
The fundamental part of it has to do with the health of the donor. That an individual that goes through living donation is checked out thoroughly to make sure that they don't have underlying heart disease or chronic kidney disease or diabetes, things that can risk organ function over time. As such, that individual that donates can do well with one kidney in their lifetime, and the individual that they donate to gets a great kidney that works well right away.
So talk to me a little bit about this living donor question. What organs can you get that can be living donors?
So most living donor organs, here we do living donor kidney transplant. You can donate a lobe of liver. So there are some individuals that'll do living donor liver surgery as well.
I know in some centers we're doing some liver donating. Let me try that again. See, I just conflated all my words right there. Living donor lung patients as well by giving a lobe of a lung, especially in children, from a parent, and so often as a bridge to another lung transplant too.
Right.
So it can be done. I don't think there's any way to do a living donor heart, though, is there?
Yeah,
I don't
not
think
yet.
so.
Yeah, except you said you had a really
I got
big
a big
heart.
heart, but
Maybe we can
you
take
might
part of that.
Yeah.
All right, so talk to me, though. There's also this thing where somebody can know they're dying, be almost dead, and then we talk to me a little bit about what's the timing for transplant from a donor to a recipient.
So the living donor, we covered, that's somebody who obviously donates, and it's a scheduled case. We do that with kidney. We're in the process of trying to develop for a liver. So those are scheduled operations. The other two types of donors are the cadaveric donation, or donation after death. And the two types of donation are brain death, where a patient is determined to have no brain function, and that's a clinical brain death. And we can actually, that's probably 90% of all organ donors take the organs after the person is declared brain dead. And then the other type is this donation after circulatory death, which means that the patient is not brain dead, but is not likely to recover and is almost likely going to die, and those patients can donate after the heart has stopped. And so those are about 15 to 10% of the donors we use. And that just means that there's more risk of preservation injury during the process because of the heart has to actually stop. Whereas the other types of donor, you actually do the operation with the heart still beating and then take the organs out after that.
All right. Well, this is we're going to have to continue this conversation. Hawkeye, you've made it in. How are the numbers looking today?
Yeah, they're looking a lot better, and we hope they were. And we've been seeing this trend now for the last 2 to 3 weeks, which is good. Right now we have 18 active infections, 63 in that discontinued criteria. Of those 18, we have 2 in the ICU and 1 on the ventilator, so a total of 81 patients. But really, I think the important number is that 18.
18. That is such a good number. I love being under 20.
Yeah.
It's making me feel really good. We had a question from a viewer yesterday that asked why we don't wear masks in here. And I think over now, we haven't, it's been a while since we've reviewed that. Yes, we're all vaccinated. That's a requirement of being on the program. But we have one other major advantage. We have a negative airflow room. Yeah. So one of the things that happened early in the pandemic is we studied this room to make sure the airflow dynamic was right. And because the air turns over so rapidly, we don't really create much of a breath cloud. It all goes up and out. Yeah. And then it goes through the hospital filtration system, and it makes this room really a very safe place. So we may not all shave the right amount, but our breath is going the right direction.
Yeah, much like our immunosuppressed units, either BMT or solid organ transplant or the specific rooms, there's a lot of engineering that has gone into this room as well for that airflow.
Yeah, and what's interesting, we haven't had any COVID cases arise from the room, nor have we had COVID cases arising from those units where we have a negative airflow. So good news all around about that. And so, Hawk, one of the other things, we talked a moment ago about the impact of COVID on transplant, but, COVID makes every other disease worse.
It does.
Yeah. And I know as an infectious disease doc, you've got to see a lot the outcomes of a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually been horrible. We talked about donors. We heard Dr. Klein talk about healthy donors. Well, if you are a recipient, number one, you're not healthy. If you get that organ, you are immunosuppressed, as we've heard about as well. And that all aids to help increase that impact and that risk of severe disease and hospitalizations. We are learning so much more about viral immunology, so much more about immunology in general, and we do understand that it's so important to have those that active immune system with those active B cells and T cells. And when you have to give these immunosuppressive drugs so that you can keep your organ and live a good quality of life, that does impact your effect or the effect on infections, and particularly as we've seen these past 2 years with COVID-19 as well.
Yeah, it is a big deal. So let's talk more about this transplanting organs from COVID patients. So if a patient is COVID positive, they can still be a donor. Is that right, Dr. Klein?
Correct. We've been utilizing organs from individuals that have had coronavirus for a while now. Probably in the summer and fall of 2021 is when we started utilizing those donors.
And there's no risk to the recipient of getting COVID from a COVID positive donor.
Correct. So as far as the organ donation data goes, non-lung transplant appears safe as far as low transmission to other organs.
That is surprising, isn't it? That would be any speculation is. I know we're not supposed to speculate, but it's a morning medical update with Dr. Stites. I do it all the time. So what's the speculation of why that is?
So some of this probably has to do with the timing of donation. That we, from the original criteria, utilized donors that were 28 days or greater out of their original COVID infection, and the swab that we do from the nose can be either positive or negative. And so from that standpoint, those donors are deemed safe, where the transmission from lung to other organs appears low. And we know that out of a series of studies that have looked at other organs at the time of donation that have not shown any virus.
And you mentioned non-lung recipients. So lung transplant patients, they can't get a COVID positive lung from a COVID positive patient?
I'd have to speak to 4 other centers in that case. I think that there are some centers that have trialed different styles of donation, but for us, I haven't seen any data come out about lung transmission.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would think certainly the lung, because we know that is the organ that is most often impacted and majorly affected. But again, I think we go back to, and Dr. Klein and Dr. Schmidt can back me up, or I'll defer to them, but we go back to these donors that are donating their organs. They are otherwise healthy. Most of the time they're young, and we do understand about the viral dynamics very early on, that really beyond that 8 days, it is really hard to culture actual infective virus from those healthy people. And so that aids in that ability to take those other organs other than lung from those healthy donors as well.
Yeah, that seems like it's made a really big difference for us overall. That whole the infection dynamic and what does it mean to be infected now, and the discussion is just so different than it was when we started. We've learned a lot. So, what are the guidelines for doing these kind of transplants, Dr. Schmidt?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. It really came full circle in 2020 after it came out. We treated COVID like the plague. If there was a donor that had COVID positivity, if they were in a COVID unit at another hospital, if there was somebody on the team that was taking care of them had COVID, nobody used those organs. And then it started to show that people were using organs who they found that they were COVID positive after the fact. And then that showed that it was safe for liver, kidney, and heart. And then there were some outcomes where inadvertently transplanted lungs in someone with a COVID positive donor, and that's where we found that was really how the transmission happened with lungs. And so now most of the donors we have seen in the last month or two because of Omicron have had COVID in the last week or incidentally positive test. They weren't dying of active COVID, but they did have a COVID positive test, and we have not seen a single transmission in liver, heart, or kidney. And so it's really come full circle where now we know that they have a positive test, but it really doesn't impact whether we use the organ or not.
Yeah, this is just, the world has changed so much. Now, we also know that there are a number of people who don't get a kidney, and about 1 in 5 kidneys from deceased donors are not used. Why is that?
Discard is a real issue. There are a lot of reasons for it. I would say that some of this comes down to organ quality and wanting to keep our recipients safe and make sure that they have the best possible outcome. At the same time, the scarcity of resources does require that we find ingenuity in identifying donors we can use. Just like COVID donor positivity is something that we do at our center that is still relatively uncommon across the country.
So, how many people die on the waiting list each year?
Liver
or kidney?
Yeah, I would say it's almost up to 8 to 10% of the population.
I think on a lung transplant list, it runs 10 to 15% of people die waiting for an organ. It's just a scarcity of organs.
Yeah, it is. The discard thing is a challenge because you think, well, why would they discard an organ that could possibly be used. But if you look at the population of patients that are dying, if you have a 70-year-old patient with kidney dysfunction, those kidneys after death, preservation, transplant into another person may not work. And if you transplant somebody with a kidney that won't work, you actually increase the risk of dying worse than they are on dialysis. So that's the double-edged sword. You say, well, we're not going to use this kidney on somebody because they would have a higher likelihood of dying after the failed transplant than they would be on that year of dialysis. But then there is the new risk of discard because of the logistics of transplant. The new allocation systems have circles of 500 miles or more where the organs are donated in. And just like this weekend, we couldn't get a plane to go somewhere because of the weather, and then the organs are sometimes now being discarded because of logistics and cold time. Whereas if the organ donation was always used locally, then the risk of that is decreased. Our OPO here in town has shown that their risk of organs being discarded is increased because of the new allocation system, and that's just because of logistics and the planes and all that other complexity that goes along with the transplant donation process.
Yeah, I know there it is an interesting discussion, and one we should deep dive into perhaps another time, but it used to be that organs were done regionally, and now they're kind of nationally. So I don't know if that's changed anything, but I know some of the eastern cities actually sort of drove that because their OPO wasn't quite as strong as at getting organs to be donated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really a complex process how that happened. It was, do we have a shortage of organs in one area versus a surplus in another area? Nobody has a surplus of organs, that's a fact. But with the allocation change, the CMS and government has also started to look at OPO performance. And the reason why we have 40,000 transplants this year is because OPOs have started to perform better nationwide. They're trying to make those metrics that they use more standardized versus modifiable by just changing the denominator of your statistics. So if all the OPOs have to use the same metrics, it makes their performance better because they have to be transparent with their numbers. And I think that's why we have more transplants this year, despite COVID, despite the allocation. And I anticipate over the next 5 years, all OPOs will be performing better.
Yeah, that'll be a big advantage, and then maybe organs can stay a little more local. So recently, the headlines have talked about how a patient with disabilities can be denied life-saving organ transplants because those disabilities, even though the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination based on disability. So talk a little bit about why that's happening and what can parents do, Dr. Klein?
Well, a lot of the evaluation that we do for potential recipients has to do with their medical eligibility, their surgical suitability, and then some of this comes down to how a patient is going to be able to care for themselves. And it gets harder as children have more dependent needs. So it's always been a gray area in transplant that seems to be have more light on it now, where we're trying harder, I think, as centers to find ways to be amenable to get individuals to transplant that could benefit.
And Tim, I'm going to guess that this is probably a fairly controversial issue, and some centers push it harder than other centers.
Yeah, I think, we had this come up at selection meeting time again, where a patient with perhaps Down syndrome or another thing that might make them more dependent on their caregivers. And somebody's quality of life is not necessarily, you can't buttonhole somebody's quality of life just because you think what they're having is good or not good because of that's not what you would like is hard to judge. And the older I get and the more experience I have in this, I am fascinated by people's ability to have quality of life and something that I would not have a quality of life. And so trying to not transplant somebody because you don't think they're going to have a good quality of life is never a good idea. So I believe we have their parents, their support system, and most of these patients will have a great support system, and their quality of life to them is going to be way improved with a transplant. And we have transplanted people with Down syndrome and other disabilities, and most of them have the best support system compared to some of our other patients, and
Yeah.
it's great for those families.
Well, and I think that's why it's so important that this whole decision rests with the transplant committee with your local institution, because they're going to try and weigh all the factors together, and most of them don't want to go to jail. So we're going to try and do the right thing for our patients and factor in all those things that are hard to measure. They're hard to put into some sort of legal formula. So there's a recent study that determined that if you were able to alter the blood type of lungs, you guys are going to have to help me with this one, and I'm a lung guy, you could raise the possibility of universal organ transplant. Explain to me how that would work. Dr. Klein.
Well, just in reviewing the study, essentially the way that a blood type is identified has to do with these antigens that sit on the surface of the blood. And they're able to find enzymes that can eliminate those antigens. So you essentially turn every donor into a blood type O, which would be a universal donor. This has no real-world practice at this point, but it is certainly intriguing to see how we can make this work. The reason that this is interesting is that blood type O is the most common. It's probably a little less than half of the population, about 30% A, and it goes down from there. So if you're a blood type B or AB, it's exceedingly rare to have donors come up for you. And as such, this is a way to broaden out that donor pool and even out certain recipients that have a disadvantage on the wait list.
So really, these enzymes are like giving us a shave of those blood type things, right? And this is
Streamline the organs.
Can I just point out that the entire panel today, which is also male, well, that's probably a problem too, but is we're all scrubby, and Hawkeye's just the scrubbiest, just to point that out. All right, so that's pretty interesting. So now, a recent study found that 30 patients who had respiratory distress, because we know that COVID has severe impact on the lung. 30 patients got a lung transplant because their lung damage is so bad. They all survived. I was a little surprised by that, but that's pretty successful. Mm-hmm. Thoughts?
Well, I think it's probably the people who survived the COVID were probably young and healthy. You know, we always try to say that people who die of COVID are older and frailer, and it's true, but the people who survive can have pretty significant life-altering conditions, and those patients are probably the ones that were healthy enough to get a lung transplant and survive, which, is amazing that now we have a new disease for lung transplant.
Yeah, there you go. And that's what we need is a new disease. Although, thankfully, with Trikafta and then the improvement in the CF outcomes, the improvement in pH outcomes, maybe there will be fewer patients who need a lung transplant. Wrong. There's still a lot of people who need lung transplant. Now we're going to add COVID into that. Okay, so it's not just adults who need organ transplants, so do kids. Talk about that process, especially if there's anything special around COVID.
As far as COVID, I'm not sure, except that there have been a lot of delays in getting to elective surgery, so the living donor surgery side, as well as finding suitable donors on the deceased donor wait list for recipients.
And how does somebody go about becoming a living donor? Let's say they decide, I want to be a living donor.
The simplest thing is to look up your local university or transplant center and call that living donor center. They can then take you through the process. Usually it involves a brief interview over the phone to make sure that there are no immediate exclusions.
All right, so we're getting some questions about things if they are improving for healthcare workers with COVID cases dropping in the community or fewer workers now calling in sick. Hawkeye, I know that this is the case. Things are getting better. Mm-hmm. We've had we got up to almost 1,000 people that were sick at one point, and now we're really, we're way below that. Like we're down by 95%. So our numbers are significantly down, and they look just like the community numbers, right? The community rate of transmission is down. That's why masks are starting to come off. Hospitalization numbers are down. We know that's the focus of the CDC guidelines. So it should change. Should not surprise any of us that our COVID numbers and our employees are also down.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, just as we are, we want everybody to be healthy. We don't want you to come to the hospital unless you have to. I think we all are encouraged by this, especially by our employee numbers, because we know that some of our capacity issues were because we didn't have the employees to take care of you when you were sick or your loved ones was sick. And so this helps us with our capacity. This helps our ability to treat you if you come to the hospital more efficiently, because we have these people now that are able to come back to work. And I think This is all a continued sign of, hopefully the good times ahead for the next few months. Right now, everything's looking good, and hopefully we can continue, keep people working. We know in general, not just for healthcare and our employees, but in general, it's very important for people to be able to go to work and not have to be home and be productive in that way. So I think we are all very optimistic that things are continuing to go in the right direction. I think that's a great thing. The less we have to be on talking about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 is a good thing. And we know that there are so many other topics in medicine that we have to promote, and we do, such as cancer screening and those annual checkups and just making sure you're doing everything right, being up to date with all of your vaccinations. So there are so many more topics, and hopefully we can start to now push SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 a little bit into the background.
I think that's really important. And one of the questions that came from our community also is, are waiting times down in the emergency room? Are things a little slower? But the reality is the hospital is packed full. And we're packed full of patients of all sorts, because remember that we were full before COVID came along. And remember we say, so where were all these patients in February of 2020? Because in February of 2020, how many COVID patients did we have? We had zero. And this point in March, we only had one. So now here we are a few years later, we have 83. And a few weeks ago, we had 214. So we have plenty of patients, and we know that our transfer center, we can't accept as many transfers as we'd like to. So yes, I think the waiting conditions are better because there's less COVID. Unfortunately, we know that hospitals are still pretty darn full. We know we're packed. We're completely full. And we have people in alternate care areas, which means that they're waiting on a bed and we're waiting on more discharges. ORs have opened back up. And trust me, for anybody out there who thinks that we make a lot of money with a lot of COVID, the answer to that is that's just complete poppycock. Because the reality is that we don't do as well with COVID. We'd far better preferred having our ORs wide open, taking the transfer patients in, because we'll do a lot better in that world. But at the end of the day, you take care of the patients, you take care of the hand that you're dealt with, and when there's a lot of COVID, our job is to make sure that people get taken care of COVID. So things are still busy in the emergency department. We have a long wait. I think most hospitals are like that. And the other thing we've noticed, and we've said this all along, remember that there is this rebound effect for patients who didn't seek care, and when they think that it's a little safer out there, they come in a little sooner in their heart attacks and strokes and cancers, which we really want you to do, Hawk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that makes the points exactly. There's really nothing to add to that. We are trying to do all that and keep you safe, keep you and your loved ones safe, keep you out of the hospital. That's better for everybody. Again, I think we go back to prevention, and we know that there is the larger population. They are coming in for everything, and we know that there are those other things besides COVID-19 that have continued to be with us, and so this just helps us in more ways than one be able to take care of you more efficiently than we were, say, over these past 2 years, really.
That's right. Jess, let's turn back to you and see if there are community questions out there that are starting to pop in.
Okay, I'm going to start with a nice comment for Dr. Timothy Schmidt. A little shout out from Mary. She says that he took wonderful care of her husband back in 2016. He performed a surgery, a Whipple surgery. Not sure what that is, but he had some complications ahead of that. But he was in the hospital here for 75 days. He received so much love and care from everyone here. But she says that Dr. Schmidt just holds a really special place in her heart. So I just wanted to pass that along to him.
Well, that's awfully nice. Maybe you do good work.
Sometimes. I was just going to comment about, the hospital being busy. I do cancer as the other half of my job, and it didn't slow down with COVID. In fact, we're seeing a lot of rebound effect, and having to slow down the ORs because of the shorting of the staff and not enough people to be here. It was really tough for those patients, but our hospital has become so much more efficient that I've done as many cases of cancer during the whole time of COVID as I did before COVID, despite the fact that we had to shut down at times. And somehow the hospital was able to make things more efficient, prioritize things, and we're seeing the same amount of patients with these 200 patients in the hospital that had COVID. It was quite amazing to see that we still functioned as high at a level as we did.
Oops, Jess, we can't hear you right now. Mike.
Guys, can you unmute me?
Yeah, we got you.
They
we got
unmuted
you
me.
now.
Okay, so Ashley has a question, and I know this is why we go through so much screening when it comes to an actual donor to make sure that hopefully they would never need another kidney, perhaps. So if a living donor later needs that part that they donated, are they more at risk when they get and need a donor part themselves?
Okay, that's an interesting question.
Kidney donors are actually given a high priority if they are end up with kidney failure down the road. So they have a system set up to reward them in the future if they do end up going on to dialysis and needing a transplant. Liver donors, I don't believe there is a system set up for them, but I know for kidney donors there is.
Well, it's interesting.
rewards.
Plus, with liver donors, you get that MELD score, and that's going to drive you up the list. And,
Yeah, the MELD score is so numbers based versus weight based, weight time based. So there's not a system built to increase the MELD score for somebody who was a living donor liver.
Because the reality is you're going to be sick anyway.
Yeah.
And so the numbers are going to climb. We're a little different than the kidney thing with dialysis. You can always be dialyzed.
Right. Yeah, it's a little bit different setup in terms of how organs succeed and when they fail. That said, the risk of encountering end-stage kidney disease after kidney donation is exceedingly rare. While there is an increase by donating at a small level, the absolute risk of kidney failure after donation is really quite rare.
And part of it is you screen these people so thoroughly to make sure they are otherwise healthy so that they can be a successful kidney donor.
Correct. That's why we're thorough in the process and make sure that they don't have any heart disease or diabetes or hypertension, other risk factors that can lead to kidney disease down the road.
Kathy wants to know how much of a factor is age for a transplanted organ?
Oh, that's a great question. Both let's take that and extend it a little bit, Jeff. Let's talk about both for the recipient and for the donor.
Yeah, so for on the donor side, a young living donor is a challenge because they're usually healthy without a lot of medical history and not a lot of chronological age, which gives us a lot of dependence on family history and other identified risk factors. That said, a young organ donor is fantastic for the recipient for the same reasons, that they have not encountered a lot of medical history in their lifetime. That said, for those that are at the other end of the chronological age spectrum, they make good donors because if they haven't encountered much medical history at that point, odds are they are suitable to donate. The organs don't necessarily do as well as a really young donor, but they can be very well matched into the right recipient.
Now, there are lots to consider right there, but we do know that there are some more challenges you get older. What's the older age for liver or kidney patients right now that you would accept as a recipient?
For a recipient, chronological age isn't as important as their medical age, and we see some 40-year-old people with diabetes, end-stage, other organ problems, and they're way sicker than a 75-year-old person who's mostly healthy. So I think we've transplanted people into their early to late 70s for both liver and kidney transplant. Heart transplant, I think, is a little bit younger because most of the time those patients need a transplant in their late 50s, early 60s at the most. For donors, livers tend to not age, so we've used donors as almost as old as 80 in a liver donor. Kidneys tend to not repair themselves over time, so they tend to decrease their function over time, but we've used donors as old as 70, I believe, for kidneys.
Jess?
Dr. Stites, Joellen has a question. She knows someone who had cystic fibrosis, received a lung transplant, but didn't survive due to being so sick ahead of the transplant itself. Would the success have been higher if they would have been healthier? They were in their 20s.
Yeah, there's a lot wrapped into the question. It's hard to know and hard to speculate without all the things. What we do know is that, and especially I know the lung transplant world really well, that the sicker you are at transplant, it is a more difficult recovery. CF patients tend to be relatively sick. If you think about it, one of the problems in CF is you have such lung tissue destruction. You have chronic infection in your lungs. It's like carrying 2 bags of pus around in you all the time. And so when they go to take those lungs out, the surgery can be immensely difficult. Sometimes it can go for hours and hours on time because they have to peel and carve those lungs out and try and make sure the infection is cleared out. And plus, CF patients tend to be very malnourished by the time they need to be a transplant. So there is this magic, there's what I call the magic bubble, which is when you're sick enough to be transplanted, so you don't want to take the risk that you may not survive. So you really, it's worth the risk to be transplanted, but you're not so sick as that you're going to endanger the time of transplant. Having said that, we know that 95% of patients survive the immediate transplant. We know that in lung disease, that if you survive for 1 year at post-transplant, your odds for surviving for 5 years go up significantly, obviously, because you survive for 1 year, but also because you've selected after the people who are going to do really well. And once you make it for 2 or 3 years, you have over a 50 or 60% chance of living 10 to 12 years. And I have one patient who's been alive for 24 years post-lung transplant. So I think that it's hard to predict, because I've also had some young people who I thought were going to do well, and they just didn't do well. In general, the younger folks do better than the older ones, but that's not always true. And there's just so much wrapped up into this question. This question begat so many other questions about what happened around that transplant. It's hard to know. But the reality is that we all work very hard. We do our very best to make sure that those patients who are getting transplanted are sick enough to be transplanted, that their quality of life has dropped to a spot where they really need a lung transplant, and we know that they should be able to survive a lung transplant. But even with all the best of the medical science can offer us, sometimes we miss.
Dr. Stites, I'm going to wrap up with the last question from Janet. So with COVID numbers going down, what do you recommend for transplant patients moving forward? Do we just need to stay in our bubble and stay away from crowds? She really would like to get out and do more things.
All right, Dr. Klein.
I wish I had a one-size-fits-all answer for this one. I think those of us that have experienced the pandemic through our patients' eyes know that there's a lot of fear in stepping out in the public maskless. And I would still recommend wearing a mask in most scenarios. There's actually a helpful tool on the CDC website to search by county that goes green, yellow, red, so that you can determine what suitability for mask wearing makes sense for you.
Hawk, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, my final thoughts were going to be tied exactly to this subject, and so I think it's important. First of all, I was just going to say that it feels like there has been a weight lifted off our shoulder this past week as a 2-year anniversary of really when our metro area, our region, our community was impacted by COVID for so many things. The first cases, everything that was shutting down. But we are seeing a light at the tunnel. But we have to understand that it's still out there. COVID is still out there. SARS-CoV-2 is still circulating. Our experience here in our community, our country is much different. Look at Hong Kong now. They are going through a horrible time at this point. So I think to Dr. Klein's point in answering the question, I think it continues to be incumbent for you to understand the risks and benefits of things that you want to do. Talk with your medical team. There are things you can still do to help prevent illness, and that is, as Dr. Stites always says, the rules of infection prevention follow with you wherever you go. Wear your mask if you are uncomfortable. We know Dr. Stites' CF patients and lung transplant patients have worn masks for decades, for a long time. You can still do that. We are getting into warmer weather. If you can do things outside, do things outside. Stay up to date with your vaccinations. If you're immunosuppressed, you need that 4th dose. We'll certainly be waiting for more information about additional dosing of vaccines. We also have the ability now to have those oral antivirals that are now becoming in more supply all around our community. So that is helpful too. If you do think you've been exposed or have symptoms, talk with your medical providers. If you are immunosuppressed, talk with those solid organ transplant doctors. Get tested early. Get on monoclonal antibody or those oral antivirals. And I think doing those things, you can have a better sense that you do have more safety and feel more safe and are able to get out and do things and be in public, because it has been hard for everybody, especially those immunosuppressed people who, as we've heard Dr. Schmidt and Dr. Klein talk about, are so at risk of those adverse outcomes. So I think doing those things is going to be important moving forward. And I think it's lucky we're moving into warmer weather where you can be outside and be in public and do things and feel much more safer than in those indoor areas as well.
Thank you. Dr. Schmidt?
Yeah, I agree totally. I think follow the data. Don't try to make things that aren't real and do what the CDC says, what your medical provider says. Try to get back to living as safe as possible. As for donation and transplant, I think, sign up to be a donor if you can. Our organs are very scarce and people need to be transplanted. And if you do have people that you know that you can donate and be a living donor, it's safe. We make sure that you are going to be taken well care of and not have any long-term problems. And if you can be a living donor, be one. Thanks again for having us on your show.
Well, I want to say thanks to you both. And here's what I know for our patients that come here. You all have great hands, great minds, and great hearts. Sometimes big hearts.
Big hearts.
Big hearts. This program today, I hope you've taken a little bit of something away called hope. We talk about that a lot throughout the pandemic, about this intersection of faith, hope, and science. And what we know is that transplant has come so far because of the science, because we trusted the science, because of drugs that suppress your immune system, because we use real therapies for real diseases, and those things really work. And that's why the average survival in transplant has gone up so dramatically over time. That has created hope for so many folks. And we know that hope is foundational in the healing process, because if you don't have hope, man, despair is one of the most quick ways to go into a very deep rabbit hole to which there is no recovery. And finally, this thing about faith, having faith in each other, having faith for me in God, but also just faith in science, because we know that it can help us as it continues to help us, which is why cancer patients live so much longer, transplant patients live so much longer, and yes, COVID patients are living so much longer. Faith, hope, science. Be inspired. Be inspired by what we heard today, and be inspired to think about being a donor. Jess, tomorrow we're going to have another great program. And don't forget, you can catch our shows anytime on the Facebook page, YouTube channel, and now Twitter. So, Jess, I think Dr. Klein may even be back with us tomorrow to continue a discussion about transplant and especially focusing on kidneys.
Yeah, and we're going to have a really great patient story. We're going to talk about that here in just a bit, but not so fast. I have to talk about this thing that's on your face.
Don't you think I look good even though it's bright red? Like I look like Saint Nick right here.
Yeah. Okay, so we need to talk about that. I think people wondering why you're looking so scruffy lately, but it's all for a good reason, a great cause, because you are participating in Shave to Save, and it is all to raise funds for the Hope Lodge here in Kansas City, which helps to house patients, cancer patients and their families, so they can be closer to their loved ones when they're getting treatment here in the hospital. So it's such a great organization. And so tell us a little bit about your strategy. First of all, I have to, you have to tell us about the ponytail.
Yeah, it's coming. What else? Well, all right, so here's the deal, guys.
You had a ponytail in the past.
I have had a ponytail in the past. I've had a man bun. It was back in the 90s. I had a little bit more hair then.
Where are the pictures?
So the question,
Where is it?
Prior to camera phones, there is very little evidence of my man bun, but it is true. And you saw that picture just flash on the screen. I looked a little younger then. I think when I shave again and I shave my head, I expect to look that young. I'm not sure that's really going to be possible. I'm not sure I'm going to look very good with a shaved head. But you know what? Here's the deal. It's in support of cancer patients. Love to have everybody put a bit of donation. They put that QR code up there. You can zap the QR code. You can make a donation. That's awesome. But I'm going to be shaving my head and, thank God, shaving my face. And we call that Shave to Save. But yes, I may develop a man bun. I'm not going to develop a frontal hairline. That's really clear. So I'm going to hope that I can get a little bit more hair in the back that I can tuck into a little bun.
It's like a mullet with the bald
Yeah, it's
top.
going to like a mullet. Stop it, Schmidt. He and I go back a long way. It's always like this.
Well, that's like Schmidt's permanent look. He always looks scruffy. And I think
He
Klein
always looks
always has the baby face.
Yeah. Well, he did before. Now that he's had to work with me, that baby face is gone.
I bet.
Big
Very
heart.
cool. So we will, of course, have the video rolling when you shave those few hairs on your head. So
I expect that, and I expect anybody who wants to make that donation, go right ahead, use that QR code. One of our guys here holds the record for the most donation. I need to raise at least $5,000, but he has $35,000 goal. Beat Jeff Wright. Not that there's any competition at all.
Ooh, that is good. Okay, you guys need to go toe to toe. I love that. Okay, so yes, click the QR code. It helps Stites out. Okay, so coming up tomorrow, yes, we're going to continue this kidney conversation. It's such a great topic. Tomorrow is actually World Kidney Day 2022. This year's campaign focuses on efforts to increase education and awareness about kidney health, really for all of us, but also those in need of a transplant. And one local woman is taking this year's message quite seriously.
Just a little mountain, yeah, over in Africa, no big deal. I think it's just overwhelming gratitude that I've been able to be a part of this process, and I'm healthy enough to be able to take on something like this.
Okay, so Stephanie Meyer, she is going to great heights to raise awareness. We'll have her inspiring story that proves nothing can stand in the way of helping out others, and how you too can be a hero like Stephanie. Have a great day. That's tomorrow at 8 a.m. Alexis.
Subscribe to our morning medical update and open mics with Dr. Stites podcasts. Now, everywhere podcasts are available.